a small village in southern France, 1944. As the rain hammers against the windows of the cafe, your nerves are stretched to breaking point. You're a member of the French resistance, escorting a crazy American to spy in the local village cafe. This madman is wearing his Marine uniform, hidden only by a cloak, and at the next table is a German general, an officer of the SS, and their assorted Nazi cronies drinking glasses of French wine. The SS officer stands up and yells out, "A toast to our glorious Führer and the 1,000-year Reich!" As their glasses chink, a Wehrmacht officer, not to be outdone, declares, "A toast to hunting down every rat-faced Maquis and the filthy American swine that leads them." You see the American's jaw tighten. You whisper that maybe you should leave. That would be the wise choice. But then the German general rises, red-faced with drink, and bellows out, "America, a mongrel nation ruled by a mere cripple, no match for Germany. When I catch an American spy, he will beg for mercy at my feet." Oh no, you see from the American's face, that comment was the last straw. He rises, and before you can stop him, he walks over to the German's table, flinging off his cloak to reveal his Marine uniform, brandishing two .45 caliber automatic pistols. The Germans stare at him with a mixture of surprise, fear, and horror. "We've been drinking toast to Hitler all night," he says. "Now I want to offer a different toast. To the President of the United States." The rest of the Germans comply, but the general refuses, staring at him with poisonous hatred in his eyes. A shot rings out, and the general clutches his cheek, red blood beginning to run down his face. "Do it, General, or the next one will be in your head." He glares back with hatred, but finally mumbles the words. "Now, a toast to the United States Marine Corps," shouts the American. The Germans reluctantly give the toast. "You're a dead man, Marine. A dead man walking," snarls the general, still clutching his cheek. The American just smiles in return. He signals you, and you both run out of the cafe into the driving rain, while behind you chaos breaks out as the general screams, "Schweinhund! Get that American!" I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Peter Ortiz is almost unknown outside the Marine Corps. Even within the Marines, he doesn't have the recognition he deserves, although his exploits in World War II were almost beyond belief. Already a decorated veteran of the French Foreign Legion and a Hollywood technical advisor, when World War II came, he joined the Marines and parachuted into Nazi-occupied France. Fighting alongside the Maquis of the French resistance, he became a huge thorn in the side of Hitler's armies, and one of the most hunted men in occupied Europe. Born in New York City on Saturday, July the 5th, 1913, Pierre Julien Ortiz was raised in a well-to-do home. He was the son of Philippe Ortiz, a French-Spanish art dealer, and his Swiss-born wife, Marie-Louise. Ortiz was raised mostly in the United States, but partly in France, and grew up speaking English, French, and German. He later acquired fluency in Spanish, Arabic, Italian, and Portuguese. After attending grammar school in America, he was sent off to prep school in France. Upon graduation, he was off to college at the University of Grenoble. However, this is where his life changed forever. Inspired by years of reading books filled with tales of adventure and daring do, Ortiz dropped out of college after a year and headed to northwestern Algeria, headquarters of the French Foreign Legion. 19-year-old Pierre promptly joined the 1st Regiment. 6 feet 3 inches tall and a natural athlete who loved running, climbing mountains and riding horses, he wanted to, quote, live a man's life, end quote, as he told English journalist G. Ward Price, the author of In Morocco with the Legion. His shocked father, however, rushed to North Africa in a bid to bring back his son by the ear and give him a good talking to. General Paul Raleigh, the father of the Legion and the creator of many of its traditions, listened to his concerns and said that an irregular enlistment could be cancelled. But Raleigh, if he hadn't loved being a soldier, could have been a master salesman. He took Philippe on a guided tour of the French Foreign Legion base. He was so persuasive, by the end of it, the senior Ortiz was completely won over and let his son stay. He even became a fervent supporter of the Legion, and after returning to Paris, founded the Friends of the Foreign Legion. Ortiz adjusted quickly to harsh life in the North African desert, where the tough legionnaires ranged far and wide, on foot, riding camels or driving armoured cars and trucks, while campaigning against rebellious natives. There was adventure aplenty for Ortiz in North Africa, provided by groups of rebels, Bedouin and Berber tribesmen, bandits and pirates. He fought in several engagements and was wounded in one of them. For his valour, he was awarded the Croix de Guerre twice and the Military Medal once. By the end of his 5-year enlistment, he was a commander of an armoured car unit with the rank of Brevet Second Lieutenant. Offered a regular rank of lieutenant if he would enlist for another 5 years, Ortiz instead headed for Hollywood. With his Foreign Legion experience and his chest full of medals, he quickly found work as a technical advisor for movies with a military or North African theme. When Great Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany on September 3rd, 1939, Ortiz knew that he could not stay out of the action and sailed from Canada that October. His ship was torpedoed by a U-boat, but a little thing like that couldn't stop Ortiz. He was able to reach Europe aboard a French destroyer. Given a battlefield commission of lieutenant, he arrived none too soon, as in May 1940, Hitler's panzers sliced through the Ardennes, and the battle for France began. During a French retreat in June, Ortiz learned that a storage dump of gasoline had not been set ablaze. He sped to the dump on a motorcycle and lit the fuel on fire. Racing away, he was struck by a German bullet, which penetrated his hip and grazed his spine. Temporarily paralyzed, he crashed the motorcycle and was captured. For torching the dump, he was later awarded his 3rd Croix de Guerre medal. Lieutenant Ortiz spent the next 15 months in POW camps, first in Germany, then in Poland, and finally in Austria. He attempted to escape from each camp. His 3rd attempt succeeded when he disappeared from the Austrian camp in October 1941. Aided by partisans along the way, he arrived in Portugal at the end of November. Both the Free French and the British had clandestine operations in Portugal, and they all wanted a piece of Ortiz, but he was determined to return stateside and see his ailing mother in California. He had already lived an amazing life, and America hadn't even entered the war yet. Resting for several months, when Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor, he tried to get a commission in the army, but Ortiz fell foul of an enemy even he couldn't beat, a military bureaucracy that moved slower than a snail. Ortiz was a man of action, desperate to get back into the fight, This long period of waiting was torture for him. As he dealt with pen-pushing bureaucrat after pen-pushing bureaucrat, finally he could bear it no longer. He decided to join the Marines instead. Commissioned as a second lieutenant, he was sent back to his old stamping ground of Morocco, where the US Army was landing as part of Operation Torch. Unlike the Army, the Marines recognized right away how special a man with Ortiz's skills was. Quickly promoted to captain, officially he was an assistant naval attaché, but this was just a cover for his real mission of organizing and leading a patrol of Arab tribesmen to gather intelligence behind German lines in Tunisia. Here, for the first time, he came into contact with an organization new in the American experience, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. The OSS was the creation of Major General William Donovan, a Medal of Honor recipient in the First World War. The mission of the OSS was collecting intelligence and conducting special operations behind enemy lines. Wild Bill Donovan said his ideal candidates for OSS operations were, quote, PhDs who can win a bar fight, end quote. With exceptional intelligence, fluency in several languages, a combat record second to none, Peter Ortiz was exactly the kind of man Donovan wanted. During January 1943, Ortiz led an OSS recon patrol behind enemy lines that gathered critical intelligence until his squad clashed with a German patrol in a fierce firefight. Though wounded, Ortiz continued throwing grenades with such accuracy that the Germans retreated. The Purple Heart was added to Ortiz's decorations. By this point, he was looking like a Christmas tree. General Donovan was highly impressed, not only by Ortiz's reconnaissance patrol and his valor in battle, but also by the professional quality of Ortiz's after-action report. Donovan requested that Ortiz be assigned to the OSS full-time. After spending a little while recuperating in a hospital at Algiers and in Washington, D.C., Ortiz was assigned to the OSS's Naval Command. In July 1943, he flew to London to train for the mission of a lifetime, parachuting behind the lines of Fortress Europe and aiding the French resistance. France had been divided up after its conquest, with the Germans ruling northern France and the west coast, while in the south the infamous Vichy collaborationist regime held sway. Slowly, acts of resistance began to break out, and on August 21st, 1941, Pierre Georges, later known as Colonel Fabian, a young communist, shot and killed a German naval officer, Alphonse Moser, in a train carriage. It was the start of a shadow war that would engulf France until its liberation. In its first years, there was no unified resistance organization. Some were communists, some nationalists, others were supporters of Free French leader Charles de Gaulle. Especially in Vichy, they often had little contact with each other and struggled to do much to threaten the Germans or their collaborators. This all began to change when the Vichy regime made a catastrophic mistake. After its victory, Germany had 1.8 million French prisoners, 10% of the male population of France. They were forced to work in German factories, and the Vichy regime wanted them back. It set up a voluntary scheme called the Relief, whereby a prisoner would be returned for every French volunteer who went to work in Germany. It was a miserable failure. Frenchmen didn't want to go to Germany to help the nation that occupied them. Desperate to get his prisoners back, and under huge pressure to fill the Reich's insatiable appetite for manpower, in 1943, Vichy imposed the Service du Travail Obligatoire, or STO. Now, all young Frenchmen had to do 2 years of compulsory labour in Nazi Germany, in conditions little better than slavery. This didn't have quite the effect they had hoped it would. It went down like a lead balloon with young men. Many fled into the countryside, hiding in the dense Mediterranean bush called Maquis, arming themselves to resist Vichy patrols that hunted them. So was born the French Resistance Rural Guerrilla Force, who took their name from their surroundings, the Maquis. When you think of the resistance, they are the image that comes to mind, wearing their red or blue berets, a cigarette dangling from their lips, and a Sten machine gun slung over their shoulders. It was not an easy life for the resistance fighters. As one leaflet read, quote, "Men who come to fight live badly, in precarious fashion, with food hard to find. They will absolutely be cut off from their families for the duration. The enemy does not apply the rules of war to them. They cannot be assured any pay. All correspondence is forbidden." End quote. Despite their growing numbers, the Allies were still concerned about the Maquis' fighting ability and the difficult task of supplying them. That's where Ortiz came in. He and 2 others would parachute into France to evaluate the fighting ability of the Maquis in an operation called Union. It was a diverse group. Alongside the colourful Ortiz was a Frenchman named Monnier, who was considered the best communications man in the resistance, and H. Fackwait, an English former schoolmaster turned spy. The mission would be to a mountainous region of southeastern France, known as the Haute-Savoie, which borders Switzerland and Italy, a rugged land today known for its fashionable ski resorts, but in 1943 it was a stronghold of the Maquis. Rising 3,000 feet above sea level was the Vécourt Plateau, an ominous-looking fortress 30 miles long and about 12 miles wide, where 3,000 Maquis were taking on the German occupiers. On a moonless night in January 1944, the drone from the engine of an RAF bomber could be heard in the distance. Suddenly, 3 figures parachuted from the aircraft and slowly glided down to Earth. A small group of French resistance fighters greeted the trio at the drop zone and quickly spirited them away to safety. Although the small band had jumped in civilian clothes, they had brought along their respective military uniforms. By doing this, they became the first Allied officers to appear in uniform in France since 1940. Ortiz, in particular, loved to wear his Marine uniform in French villages to raise morale. This led to some problems, as you can probably imagine. The British agent, Fackwait, later said, quote, "Ortiz, who knew not fear, did not hesitate to wear his U.S. Marine captain's uniform in town and country alike. This cheered the French, but alerted the Germans, and the mission was constantly on the move." End quote. The free agents discovered that the French were willing to fight, but were grossly ill-equipped and ill-trained. Money was also in short supply. However, the men of Operation Union went right to work to instruct the band of resistance fighters. As the months passed, the Maquis improved and stepped up their attacks on the Germans in the region. The Haute-Savoie territory, once considered pacified by the Germans, was now downgraded to not safe at all. Reports soon filtered back to the Wehrmacht of an American Marine leading Maquis raids and ambushes, causing the feared Gestapo to increase their interrogations of French farmers and townsfolk. Ortiz seemed like a ghost-like figure, appearing here and there, and then disappearing. He walked into villages in his uniform in the middle of the day to the cheers of the townsfolk, and was gone before German soldiers could arrive. He led raids that stole German vehicles or set fire to German supply dumps. When 4 RAF airmen were downed over the region, Ortiz moved heaven and earth to smuggle them to safety. The British report on this reads like a Hollywood film. Quote, "During the course of his efforts to obtain the release of these officers, he raided a German military garage and took 10 Gestapo motors, which he used frequently. He even procured a Gestapo pass for his own use, in spite of the fact he was well known to the enemy." End quote. With his stolen Gestapo cars and pass, he successfully drove the airmen to the Spanish border so they could escape. His most famous stunt occurred while on an intelligence-gathering mission in a local cafe, as we saw in the opening dramatization. Wearing civilian clothes and a cape, he made a habit of strolling into German-occupied towns and listening to local gossip. One night, he found himself sitting in a cafe near some German soldiers who were grousing about the troublesome Maquis and their hated American allies. We saw how that worked out for them. To be fair, There are multiple versions of this story, including one where he gunned them all down, but I have used the version that Ortiz always told when asked about it. The trio succeeded eventually in organising the resistance fighters into effective fighting units, and they expanded their harassment operations. But the Germans countered, and the Frenchmen had to face superior panzer grenadier battalions with insufficient guns and ammunition. Although they fought bravely, the resistance groups were forced onto the defensive and had to resort to hit-and-run raids where possible. In late May 1944, after nearly 5 months of such daring-do, Ortiz and his comrades were pulled out of Vercors by aeroplane and flown to London. Decorated with the Navy Cross, he was promoted to Major. Back in France, events were rapidly escalating. Enraged by the attacks of the Maquis, the Germans countered with horrific atrocities. This was especially true of their allies, the pro-Nazi French paramilitary force, the Milice. Few units in World War II were as despicable as the Milice. It was filled with the absolute dregs of French society, pro-German fascists, psychopaths, crooks and rapists. They acted as bully boys for the Germans and fought the resistance, earning the hatred of most of their fellow countrymen. In Vercors, they burned villages and farms, massacring the inhabitants. They would end their days as the SS Charlemagne Division, and would die defending Hitler's bunker in Berlin from the Soviets. At 23:15 hours on the 5th of June 1944, a broadcast was made from the BBC in London. It was the second part of the poem, Chanson d'Automne, quote, "Wound my heart with a monotonous languor," end quote. Upon hearing this, resistance leaders in France knew this was a call to arms, as the Allied invasion was imminent. Their job was to tie up German forces and prevent them engaging with the Allies. In Haute-Savoie, at Vercors, the resistance was ready to put everything they'd been learning from Ortiz into action. The Vercors uprising had begun as they declared the region an independent republic on July the 3rd. It would sadly be a premature decision. With the famous Normandy landings occurring in June, the Maquis thought the invasion of southern France would happen straight after. In fact, Operation Dragoon wouldn't be until August, 2 months later. The Allies did try to help them. On July the 14th, American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers dropped 1,500 canisters of arms, ammunition, and other supplies. This wasn't actually the blessing it appeared to be. The raid happened in broad daylight and provoked a bloody German response, quote, "The inhabitants ran out in the streets shouting and waving to the flyers. 30 minutes later, the Germans began bombing and strafing the town. This prevented the men from collecting the containers. Only at night was it possible to gather 200 of them. The Germans also started the destruction of the town. It was set ablaze, and enemy fighters machine-gunned people endeavouring to save their belongings from their homes." End quote. This was the last straw for the Germans. It was time to crush the Maquis of Vercors once and for all. On the 21st of July 1944, a full-scale assault began, with the Germans pushing down into the plateau from the captured village of Saint-Nazaire and attacking the passes and roads to the south, east and west. At the same time, glider troops landed on the newly constructed resistant airstrip to attack the town of Vassy-en-Vercors. Over 10,000 battle-hardened and fanatical Waffen-SS troops were soon able to push into the plateau, giving no quarter as they advanced. Desperate pleas to Algiers and London went unheard. The Maquis counterattacked the Nazis on 4 separate occasions, but were driven back. With no air artillery support, the resistance fighters took horrendous casualties. Finally, their leaders were forced to order the remaining Maquis to flee into the forests and mountains. They sent a bitter message to London and the Free French authorities in Algiers, telling them they were, quote, "criminals and cowards," end quote, for not sending help. The SS systematically set out to terrify their population into submission. Any Maquis who were captured were summarily executed. Villages and hamlets were burned to the ground, and their inhabitants massacred, some in quite brutal ways. 20 wounded fighters, who were found in a large cave used as a first aid station, were murdered where they lay. The town of Vassy-en-Vaucouz, where some of the heaviest fighting had taken place, was razed completely to the ground. The Vaucouz Republic had lasted for less than a month. It was a revolt, doomed from the start. 4,000 ill-equipped and poorly trained Maquis was simply no match for 10,000 experienced and well-equipped German battle troops. Trying to save something from the wreckage, especially with the invasion of southern France coming up, the Allies decided to finally send more help and advisors to the remaining Maquis Vaucouz. To lead the expedition, they needed someone the Maquis knew and respected, someone who had shown a remarkable ability to cause a severe headache for the Germans with limited resources. They needed Peter Ortiz. Ortiz would lead a squad of 5 fellow Marines, a free French officer called Joseph Arcelin, and Captain Francis Coolidge of the U.S. Army Air Forces. It was imaginatively called Union 2, and its purpose wasn't just to train the Maquis, but to help them cause as much havoc as possible behind German lines to aid the Allied advance in southern France. As well as Ortiz's men, they were going to drop the largest parachute supply shipment of the whole war, 864 containers filled with Sten guns, Bren automatic rifles, Lee Enfield rifles, anti-personnel grenades, pistols, anti-tank weapons, over 2 million rounds of ammunition, and several tons of explosives, plus medical supplies, clothing and food. It was hopefully enough to start a small war. The team assembled at Nettishall Airfield in the UK. Here they were handed a silver hip flask of cognac, Lucky Strike cigarettes with no markings on the pack, and the equivalent of $1,000 in French francs. Ortiz was also given a suitcase with 1 million francs to be used to aid the Maquis. On August 1st, 1944, 2 weeks before the Allied invasion of southern France, Ortiz and his men parachuted for an American B-17 bomber out into the dark night sky, heading towards a drop zone in Vaucouz, where the Maquis were waiting for them. Marine Sergeant Jack Risler made it to the ground safely, a French resistance fighter rushing up to him and kissing him on both cheeks. Others weren't so lucky. Sergeant Charles Perry's chute did not open, and he was killed in the fall. A malfunction in the static line caused it to snap, resulting in his death. Also, Gunnery Sergeant Robert Lassalle hurt his ribs and spine upon impact. Maquis members wasted no time in collecting the ammunition and supplies. To confuse the Germans, the townspeople of nearby Albertville informed them that 2 battalions of American paratroopers had landed. That misinformation allowed the Union 2 members to evade the enemy. After burying Perry with full military honours, Ortiz and his men started training the Maquis of the Bull Battalion. The unit was named after its leader, Captain Jean Bull, a local Maquis hero. Disaster almost struck again when one young Frenchman picked up a Sten gun and began firing wildly in all directions like in a cartoon. As bullets whizzed around, everyone dove for cover. Luckily, no one was injured. However, the unfortunate resistance fighter did shoot off his own toe in the accident. After a week of familiarization with the weapons, Ortiz's group began patrolling the area. The crafty Marine established Maquis ambush sites, usually selecting a curve in the road or a small rise nearby. He had memorized all the various German units and would stay hidden as they passed, counting vehicles and troops. The Germans, however, had found out from informers that their old nemesis had returned to Vaucouz. They hadn't forgotten the revolt back in July and were still on edge. Orders were issued that Ortiz and his men must be hunted down at all costs. Ortiz had been working on an ambitious plan to drive the Nazis from the Tarentaise Valley with help from Bull and 200 of his Maquis. In preparation, the men of Union 2 and some of their Maquis allies entered a hamlet called Montgeraud. But it was here that things began to go wrong. A small German spotter plane circled them overhead. The Nazis knew they were coming. Soon German mortars opened up on the small group, quickly finding their mark. As the shelling increased in ferocity and accuracy, they started taking casualties, and several wounded resistance fighters were evacuated. Ortiz knew they couldn't stay here. His bold plan would have to be abandoned for now. Leaving 2 badly wounded Maquis in the town church, the men of Union 2 took to the steep hills surrounding the village, trying to evade the German forces that began to swarm over the area, attempting to cut off and surround them. Trapped in the steep walled valley, now infested with Nazi troops, they appeared to be doomed. But Ortiz wasn't done for yet. When night fell, they started crawling silently through the German lines. It was a nerve-wracking experience. Rissler later recalled, quote, "The German patrols came so close. I'd say 30 to 40 feet, both foot and motorcycle patrols. They gave themselves away, though, because they liked to sing. We could hear them coming. We forded the local river and went to the village of Centron. It was midnight, and we stopped to rest. And damn, if another German patrol didn't come by. They had the area pretty well surrounded. We just froze. They didn't see us and they just went by." End quote. Meanwhile, back in Montgeraud, the Nazis uncovered the pair of wounded Maquis. They were promptly shot, and the church was put to the torch. They began rounding up villagers to be executed in retaliation, a grim example to southern France of the cost of defying the Führer. Union 2 was still dodging the Germans. On the morning of August the 15th, the band of agents was just outside the town of Longuevoy. Ortiz instructed the party to stay hidden while he made his way to the hamlet. Making contact with the mayor, Ortiz explained the group's precarious position. He returned to the rest of the party and brought them back to the hamlet to be hidden and fed for the night. The following morning, their luck finally ran out. They walked to the village limits in single file, with Ortiz in the lead, followed by Rissler, Ursulin, Coolidge, and 2 other Marines called Bodner and Brunner. That's when all hell broke loose. Suddenly, a German armoured patrol rounded a bend in the road and saw the party in the open. With your collar pulled up and a beret on your head, you try not to draw attention to yourself. As the group walks in single file across the bridge, you can almost feel a heavy weight being lifted. It's been a stressful time dodging the German patrols. But soon you'll be at the hamlet limits and freedom. But then, suddenly, a German armoured patrol swerves around the bend, and they spot you. Nazi soldiers pour out and charge towards your group, guns blazing. Coolidge cries out and clutches his leg as you return fire, and the 2 leading German soldiers fall. The group is forced to split up. Ortiz, Rissler, and yourself fight a running gun battle with the Germans through the village streets. As Ortiz kicks down the door of a house, you feel bullets smashing into your backpack and hear the familiar ricochets coming off of a nearby wall. Turning around, you rake a German soldier with bullets as he falls to the floor. Taking cover inside the house, bullets are soon pounding into its walls as you return fire from the windows. You're caught like rats in a trap, but you won't make it easy for them. Ortiz and his men tried to escape. Coolidge was wounded in the leg, but he and Brunner still managed to flee to the river. Ursulin was caught as he tried to hide in an apple orchard. Ortiz, Rissler and Bodner ran back to Centron. Running from house to house, they were taking the bulk of the German fire. Ritter's backpack was full of bullet holes as he tried to negotiate a drainage pipe to find safety. Miraculously, he was somehow not wounded. The remaining 3 men were holding off an entire battalion of German troops by themselves in a spectacular feat of bravery and arms. But the terrified inhabitants of Centron were begging the Marines to surrender to avoid German reprisals. Years later, Ortiz would write, quote, "Since the activities of Mission Union and its previous work were well known to the Gestapo, there was no reason to hope that we could be treated as ordinary prisoners of war. For me personally, the decision to surrender was not too difficult. I had been involved in dangerous activities for many years and was mentally prepared for my number to turn up. Sergeant Bodner was next to me, and I explained the situation to him and what I intended to do. He looked me in the eye and replied, 'Major, we are Marines, and what you think is right goes for me too.'" End quote. Truly the greatest generation. Ortiz hollered out to the Germans to cease their firing. When it finally eased up, he boldly strolled out to the street. An old Frenchwoman raced towards him and threw herself in front of Ortiz to protect him. Gently pushing her aside, the Marine Major kept walking towards the Nazi lines, with machine gun bullets kicking up dust around him. Soon he was face to face with the German commander, Major Kolb. Ortiz explained that his group would surrender as long as there were no acts of vengeance directed towards the townspeople. He explained that they were innocent, had not given them any support, and that his group was just passing through. It was a lie, but Kolb seemed to have bought it. He agreed to the terms. Ortiz ordered his men to come out and call them to attention. He then told them not to surrender any information except name, rank, and service number. Arcelin, who had already been captured, was brought forward to be with the rest of the group. He had put on the dead Perry's uniform and pretended to be a Marine named George Anderson. The deception worked in spite of the fact that Arcelin could not speak a word of English. Apparently he grunted and mumbled a lot, while Ortiz and co. claimed he was a Marine of few words. Luckily the Germans bought it, or Arcelin would have been executed. Kolb was quite upset when he learned that a mere 3 men had held off his entire battalion. Not believing Ortiz that this was his whole force, he ordered his men to tear the village apart, looking for more Americans. When none were found, he looked at Ortiz with amazement and said, quote, "You are either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and I'm not sure which." End quote. Impressed by the Americans, he ordered his men to treat them with the utmost respect. Kolb knew they were commandos, and that under the direct orders of the Führer, all such men were meant to be executed as soon as they were caught. However, their bravery had impressed Kolb, and he didn't inform the SS or Gestapo. He accepted Ortiz's obvious lie that they were part of the Allied invasion of southern France. It probably didn't hurt that the war was obviously lost by this point. Outside of the real fanatics, few soldiers were to face war crimes accusations. Sent to a prison camp at Chambéry, Ortiz asked for an interview with the commanding general, Karl Plum. When his request was granted, the bold Marine Major marched into Plum's office and demanded that the 157th Alpine Division surrender to him personally. Plum threw an absolute fit and told Ortiz to get out of his office before he had him shot. Needless to say, the surrender did not take place. As the Allies advanced, Ortiz and other OSS warriors were transported by truck from one German army camp to another, until they finally reached a POW camp in northern Italy. From here, they were then herded north to Malag Milag Nord, a naval prisoner of war camp near the North Sea port of Bremen. Ortiz made several unsuccessful attempts to escape during the long journey and was badly beaten, but he and his comrades were glad to find that Malag Milag was far more comfortable than the prison camps they were previously used to, and there was reason for hope. For a black market network which had links outside the camp, the prisoners learned that the British were getting close. The camp was divided into two separate compounds, one for officers and the other for enlisted men. Ortiz found himself with some 400 other officers, nearly all of them British. Only 3, including Ortiz, were American. The senior Allied officer was a British Royal Navy captain. He wasn't very impressed when Ortiz immediately started speaking to him about escape attempts. He told him escape attempts were frowned upon. The motto here was to wait until the end of the war. There was no way Ortiz was waiting till the end of the war to escape. He immediately declared himself senior American officer and said the American POWs would plan to escape. On the night of December the 18th, Ortiz, an American Navy lieutenant, spent more than an hour cutting and crawling for a series of wire fences before reaching an open field and making a dash for freedom. Searchlights illuminated the running Americans, and they were soon recaptured and locked in solitary confinement. On April 10th, 1945, with Allied forces moving into Germany, the Nazis decided to move most of their remaining prisoners to a POW camp at Lübeck, a port on the Baltic Sea about 120 miles to the northeast. As the prisoners began the trek, marching in a column along the side of the road, Ortiz finally got his chance to escape. "Snell! Snell!" yells at a German guard as the long line of prisoners you're a part of snakes along the road. An English prisoner collapses to the floor exhausted. The German guard walks up and begins kicking him viciously. "Move, Schweinhund! Get up, you lazy Englander pig!" As the Brit struggles to rise, the impatient guard raises his machine gun and fires. "The same will happen to any man who slows us down." You glare back at him with hatred as you begin shuffling back down the road again, when the droning hum of an aircraft fills the air. Frantically scanning the sky, you spot RAF Spitfires swooping down towards the column. Pandemonium breaks out as prisoners and guards flee for cover. The guard who murdered the British prisoner loses his head and runs down the road. As a Spitfire opens up, their bullets rake his body. You're about to take cover yourself when you notice that American, Ortiz, making a run for it to the tree line with 2 others. Seizing the opportunity, you run after them to join in their escape. While most in the column dove for cover, Ortiz dashed into the nearby woods. 2 Americans and 1 Englishman followed him. With the Spitfires gone, German guards ordered the prisoners back into a column, and the march began again. No one seems to have noticed the disappearance of Ortiz and the others. The escapees moved only at night, hoping to encounter British troops, but all they ever saw were Germans. After 10 days of narrowly escaping detection, and with nothing to eat, Ortiz decided they should return to their old POW camp and see if any food was left behind. They walked into the camp, and the few guards there, anticipating a German surrender, mostly ignored them. Among the few prisoners still there were the enlisted Marines from Ortiz's OSS group. A week later, a British armoured division finally reached the camp. Most of the remaining prisoners eagerly boarded the trucks for transportation to the rear, but not Ortiz and not his men. Ortiz asked if his group could join the British division. As he later put it, quote, "We Marines wanted to join this unit in order to bag a few more Germans before hunting season closed," end quote. The mystified British refused, and the Americans were sent back to the rear. Ortiz was debriefed by an OSS officer and then the commander of the U.S. Navy's 12th Fleet, decorated him with a 2nd Navy Cross. By this time, the war in Europe was over, and Ortiz requested combat duty in the Pacific. By July 1945, he was in California, preparing a team for an OSS mission to Indochina. but the atomic bombs in August ended the war. Ortiz returned to Hollywood as a technical advisor, beginning with 13 Rue Madeleine, a World War II spy thriller released in 1947, starring James Cagney. Director John Ford, a veteran of the Navy and the OSS, who was involved in his own daring do when he parachuted behind Japanese lines into the Burmese jungle, offered Ortiz a role in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, starring John Wayne. Suddenly, Ortiz was an actor. Eventually, he appeared in 5 of John Ford's movies, and in 27 movies altogether, as well as 2 television series. He died in 1988, leaving behind a wife and a son, who by then was a Marine officer himself. Ortiz was buried with full military honours in Arlington National Cemetery. In attendance were not only high-ranking American officers, but also high-ranking French officers. Peter Ortiz died a hero for 2 nations. In May 1984, Jack Risler and John Bodner returned to France to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Union II and the Great Parachute Drop. They visited the grave of Charles Perry, who had died when his parachute failed, and were treated as heroes by the townspeople on their return trip to the region. The French people had not forgotten the sacrifices they had made so many years earlier, so they could be freed from the tyranny of the Nazi regime. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. Next episode, we head to the wild American frontier, where France and Britain are about to have a final showdown for control of North America. Expect massacres, scalpings, and cameo roles from the Founding Fathers aplenty as we cover the French and Indian War. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.